Moral men and immoral war. When you read the literature of the war voyeurs, that particular breed of journalist who peeks through the curtain of the battlefield to get a glimpse of the action in hopes that some of it will stick to him, but not so much that it will make demands of his character, you often hear of the dehumanization which is taught to soldiers and exhibited in the din of battle. In what almost sounds like an explanation, the voyeur exerts himself into a moral pedestal in order to look down upon the warfighter, infusing elements of pity to mask the sensation that he who fights must be less than he who observes. The voyeur does so in grand statements such as, in order for the soldier to be effective, he must dehumanize his enemy, sacrifice that part of himself which can empathize with the one he is fighting, so that he will not hesitate when ordered to strike. This type of language dehumanizes both sides of the conflict, artificially propping up the observer in a position of moral authority, a high ground of sorts, which he often much diffuse that aura with self-degrading spectacle. First, the enemy is assumed dehumanized by the soldier to make him effective, and second, the dehumanizing of the soldier by the army, country, or force he is part of. Reaching into the level of the cultural zeitgeist, the depiction of soldiers as superhuman, righteous defenders of freedom often backlashes into their later demonization as emotionless, killing automatons, or war criminals sanctioned by the state, relegated to the scrap heaps of society when no longer needed. These dehumanizing generalizations are called into question on the level of the individual, which further invites the inquiry, is the soldier made more effective when devoid of empathy? And if so, can it be justified? Broken down into three cascading questions, it looks like this. First, is it true? Is it true that either by training or by choice, soldiers, warfighters, and insurgents deliberately practice dehumanizing their opponents? Do they do so to make their job easier, or to cope with the moral weight of the act of killing? Second, does one engaged in combat perform better? Do they gain from dehumanizing their opponent? And third, given the conclusion, what can be said about what a person ought do in regards to a worldview construction, metaphysics, in order to be A, most effective in combat, and B, maintain a moral standing, or, if necessary, maintain a balance of the two? So it begins with the question, is it true? This singular question will have the benefit and burden of being both answered easily and with great difficulty at the same time. I have studied under instructors who suggest something like controlled psychopathy, and seen leadership attempts to paint a broad but ultimately cheap grand narrative about the conflicts we engaged in. Do those engaged in war dehumanize their enemy? Yes. Do they all? No. It only takes one to break the claim of all. If one of us has chosen not to dehumanize their enemy, then they can reason that they are not alone. War is a near timeless concept which has involved the lives of billions. It is hubris to believe that all men think the same way about their opponent as you do, and the same to believe that you are the only one in history to see your enemy as human. So where does this claim come from? Where does the idea, which reaches into the heavens like a paradigm, ground itself in reality? The claim is easily represented in War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning by Chris Hedges. Pages 73 and 74. A soldier who is able to see the humanity of the enemy makes a troubled and ineffective killer. To achieve corporate action, self-awareness and especially self-criticism must be obliterated. We must be transformed into agents of a divinely inspired will, as defined by the state, just as those we fight must be transformed into the personification of unmitigated evil. There is little room for individuality in war." End quote. This claim relies on a series of assumptions, whose primary function is to dehumanize the individual by offloading responsibility to the whole, to the system, to the army, to the nation, or to war itself. It suggests that just as it suggests, and thus sets up for reproduction, a belief against the agency of the individual. In order, it must assume that the fervor is led by the top, be it mythical generals, elusive politicians, or mystical gods created in our own image. To convey that people themselves are somehow less responsible for their individual moral choices by account of pressures. It conflates justifications with explanations. It is unclear whether war does this to men, or if men do it to sustain war. It seeks evidence from dubious inference. It injects meaning into observation. It assumes that we, by nature, provide evidence by absence, and that all we see is dehumanization, and thus impose the example of dehumanization as a critical example of all wars. It sees one tree and says all trees must be like this, which is the black swan fallacy. It should be understood as confession by projection, that the one speaking, the journalist or observer, is offloading the responsibility for their own dehumanization onto the troops, and that the media man can claim how brutal and dehumanizing war is, and that, this is being partially read, that the media man can claim how brutal and dehumanizing war is, serves as a window more into how they think than it does on how the warfighter is trained to think himself. It reflects more on the speaker than the actor. It disregards the accounts of those who fought in conflicts and the ethical struggles that they have had to deal with. For the simpler and easily justified framework imposed by the observer, who is, in the end, projecting the responsibility he bears for his ideas into the void. The media outlet which implies that soldiers fight with cold-hearted brutality is the one who often wishes to be cruel upon their enemies. But evidence of dehumanizing by an observer must be differentiated from the acts of the warfighter. Another assumption which undergirds the concept that no war can be justified, and relies on the propaganda of wicked drivers who taint the innocence of soldiers with pseudo-pragmatism. This is the erasure of the distinction between the justifications of war for a country and the motivations of the individuals engaged in war. The reason why a country will go to war is different than the reasons why an individual will volunteer to participate in that war. At this point, the original claim, the concepts that soldiers being instructed in the dehumanization of their opponents as a rule, must be called into question. The validity of the assumption as a whole stands on such unsteady ground that a different moral framework and paradigm may take its place. Part of that alternative framework begins with how we understand the second question. Is it effective? How do we measure the success? How we measure the success, then, to answer the second question, how we measure the success heavily impacts and informs the answer. By what do we mean effective? What are the measures of success? What consequences contribute to or are excluded from answering this question? The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, as well as previous conflicts, represents the consequences of not setting clearly defined conditions for victory, or at least not being honest about them. From Vietnam to contemporary Ukraine, heavily publicized wars have struggled with two distinct issues: presenting openly what the motive and cause for the conflicts are, and providing adequate leadership to those engaged in war in the form of setting a clear goal. If the war of Afghanistan was to prosecute Osama bin Laden, roughly half of that war was fought after he died in 2011. And this issue trickles down to the individual, who is most often focused on learning the skills necessary to his survival and success as a warfighter. As a soldier, then, a more capable a more capable warfighter if he, by training or by choice, redundant, sees his enemy as something less than human. The training that you receive is nothing if you do not choose it. The immediate pragmatism of a ruthless and brutal executioner may stand up in comic books and fictional novels, but looks very different in the real world of violence. Brutally violent dictators come to extremely violent ends as soon as the people they rule over, be them advisors, the populace, or the enforcers they see, or their own enforcers, who may see a moment of weakness or an opportunity for betrayal. Tyrants would not be able to rule with an iron fist if it wasn't for the people who enforced it. An individual who enters into combat does so differently than they hunt an animal. History paints a long, bloody tale of men who begin to see their enemies as prey, not as people. There is no good situation where you consider your enemy as something that they are not. And the consequences in war are often death or worse. A person engaged in war who dehumanizes their enemy ultimately weakens their own ability to fight in the long run. They exchange a short-term relief from the burden of their moral decisions they are making from the consequences. They exchange short-term relief from the burden of their moral decisions for the long-term consequences of those choices. And they exchange those consequences for the long-term crushing and debilitating weight of the summary of those choices. After years of fighting, it is not uncommon to hear men exasperate that the war they fought was unjust, that it was led by evil men who deceived them. The presence of an influence does not erase the responsibility of the individual, for even though they may have been taught to dehumanize their opponent, it is the choice of the individual himself to assent to such ideas, to take them in and to make them their own. In this way, an individual, as well as their leadership, can be both held accountable for their actions, as human organizations are constructed of people, and so people are judged first as people. A warfighter who dehumanizes his opponent gains the temporary freedom of thought from the weight of their actions, but ultimately weakens their ability to fight effectively. Their denial of reality, that they fight against people who, like them, have hopes, beliefs, and desires, opens them up for manipulation, both from their own ranks and from crafty weavers of narrative, to commit atrocities that aid their enemies more in the long run or against their own objectives. A soldier who, in the language of Hedges, commits to the crusade of war, sacrifices the ability to win the war for the strength to win the individual battle. They win the gunfight but lose the war, both on those they fight and worse, on the home front. This cannot be ultimately laid at the feet of leadership alone, although they are not exempt from it, for those with great influence will face great judgment of how they wield it. Attempts at reducing the effectiveness of a warfighter to his capabilities on the battlefield has resulted in countless examples of him being ultimately defeated, destroyed, or left abandoned in the long term. A war is not fought for the war itself, and a military fails from the top when it does not set the objective for victory. The individual warfighter cheats himself when they themselves sacrifice their ability to fight tomorrow for the ability to fight today. Whatever or however, this is further complicated by attempts by the state to compensate for the needs of the warfighter. Where a soldier needs stability at home, the state provides anti-discrimination training. Where the soldier needs the ability for his family to be stable, or where his family to be provided for, the state merely provides some form of a handout, obfuscated by their needs. Where the warfighter needs mentorship in navigating the moral complexity of their environment, the state provides propaganda to convince him that he is righteous, not by his actions, but for his sacrifice to the country. This is why it can be difficult for soldiers to respond to statements like, "Thank you for your service," as if it was a sacrifice to do so when they thought it was right. The act of doing something right itself is not a sacrifice, although sacrifices may have to be made in order to accomplish that which is right. When it comes to skill development, practitioners simplify complicated movements and situations into their parts, not to reduce the action or event as a whole into a simple narrative, but to better understand the parts and thus construct a better understanding of both the skill and the event. The phrase "slow is smooth, smooth is fast" does not imply that to move slowly is the same as to move quickly, but that in order for one to be able to be moved fast, one must practice slowly, whether to refine the micro movements that contribute to the whole, or to practice at a speed that they can compute until that mental space is freed up. This same reasoning applies to the warfighter, who, if they take shortcuts, sets themselves up for catastrophe when the weaknesses of that cheat are necessarily taken advantage of. A warfighter who dehumanizes his enemy will be crushed by either A, another fighter who also dehumanizes him but has situationally gained the advantage, or B, someone who understands his humanity, and is thus able to outmaneuver him as a human. The concept of human rights rides in tandem with the reality of individual responsibilities. If we have rights as individuals, then there is something above all individuals which holds the position of the judge. Morality, being evaluated on that level of the individual, and their actions trickle upwards, not downwards. The idea that soldiers who are taught to dehumanize their enemies make better cogs in the machine argues that unthinking, uncritical, and ultimately hobbled humans make better warfighters. This follows to either A, condemn the actions of the war as a whole, which may actually be correct, but also B, suffer under the same judgment that utopias fall under. In order to make a utopia, you first must remove something from humans that makes them human. Most often, this is the will. As the moral decisions of individuals are judged, in part, by their desire or their will, if that will is removed, or their ability to have a will is removed, a part of the method of making those judgments about them is also removed, and thus they are less than human. In order to achieve your utopia, you must take away that which makes us human. But the question remains, do unthinking soldiers even function better on the ground at war? The answer should easily be no. For as war is expanded and changed, time and time again, in every case where the capability of a force was determined solely by its leader, all that is needed to defeat them is to defeat that leader. It slants all too heavily into centralization, and accomplishes this by dehumanizing the individual. A leader who treats his troops and followers like automatons will find them crushed and incapable if he is not there to lead them. The development of war has progressed away from centralization to decentralization. Before Napoleon brought the concept of the non-commissioned officer, who leads from his advancement within the ranks rather than from appointment, battles were most quickly won and lost in a chess fashion by defeating the leader, by crushing the king. If you could crush the king, you could crush the army. But the non-commissioned officer challenged this. If you could crush the officer, you could crush the army. Now didn't work because the non-commissioned officer, who led from the ranks, could lead his men. In World War II, the fusion of leadership from the ground and direction from above led Allied victory to defeat a force which preyed upon the infrastructure and weaknesses of its enemies. The rise of insurgencies in guerrilla warfare decentralized further until the presence of a leader seemed less important or more fragilizing, or making more fragile, or adding a weakness, such that it was less important that a leader was present, rather an ideology which led the movement. So, as conflict continues to decentralize, Also, the ability and agency of the individual warfighter continues to increase in importance. What made special operations units stand out more often than their gear and tactics was the ability for the individual soldier to rise to leadership and make decisions as he was closest to the decision-making point. It armed the operator, as it is phrased, with the ability to make decisions on the ground. It trusted him with judgment, making him infinitely more dangerous than those who fought without the trust of judgment. Perhaps in the global war of terror, the single most important development when it comes to the warfighter was agency, instead of being a cog in the machine. So to conclude the second question, no, a warfighter is not made more effective in combat by dehumanizing their enemy. And an organization which removes the agency from its fighters strips them of, if not, the most important aspect of their abilities going forward, the ability to think. We live in a world where everything is not as it seems, and that which turns out to be just as we understood it often stands boastful outside the reach of justice, or so it appears. We understand that our country, that men on behalf of the nation go out into the world to engage in warfare, in the influence of governments, where pieced together historical accounts struggle to resemble anything other than this vicious dictum, the ends justify the means. A dictator is propped up, resources and influence provided to him in order to prevent another dictator or ideology from rising to power in that region. That chosen dictator then oppresses his people, infringing on their rights, inflicting wanton destruction on people who, of their own accord, appears to be of no threat to America. We see men and women volunteer into the military with the intent to do good, yet their naivety cannot be anything but expected. For how could you expect youths virile enough for war and starved of meaning to understand the complexities of geopolitical conflicts and the weight behind an agency's decision to create or utilize this or that power vacuum? Just as it is unreasonable to expect what is kept secret to be treated as common knowledge, it is equally unreasonable to believe that those in such positions are something other than people. War is done by people, between people, and upon people. It is people who make the decision to invade a country, murder a population, and join in the defense of their homeland. The naivety of the individual who volunteers for war is demonstrated in, not that they chose to sign up, but that they are young beings in an old world. So in conclusion, we actually can answer the third question. What is the proper and correct metaphysical, and ethical understanding of war? 1. War is waged by people and between people and upon people. 2. Individuals choose to participate in war, whether or not they are influenced to do so. 3. Morality is evaluated on the level of the individual. If it is immoral to dehumanize an individual, it is also just the same immoral to consider them less than human or to strip them of agency and expect them to function as if they were human. The moral standing of a war is different than the moral evaluation of those who participate in it. People choose to fight in war for reasons other than what caused that war. So, just as a man can choose to participate in a moral war for immoral reasons or act immorally within a war, so a man can so can a man act morally when engaged in an immoral war and fight for reasons that can be judged as moral. I'll read that last part again. Just as man can choose to participate in a moral war for immoral reasons, a man can choose to participate in an immoral war for moral reasons, because his actions and his choices are evaluated on the level of the individual. One is tempted to project and offload the responsibility of one's actions and choices to the abstract concept that is war or violence, giving it godlike influence over the chaos. By surrendering to the din and nihilism of war, one seeks to assuage themselves of the responsibility while retaining the sweetness of guilt when he desires pity, the glory of struggle when he wants praise, and the freedom or liberation from his intellect and conscience when he is alone in the darkness. He comes to conclude, in the gaps found in his surrender, that he was not courageous but a coward, not in the heat of the moment, but in the moments leading up to it, where he knew he was wading into a moral minefield with consequences, but instead left the direction of his choices up to some abstraction of influence that he calls war. It is not my choice. I'm being told to. In doing so, he rejects his own humanity and rejects the responsibility that is demanded of a thinking being. This has been Moral Man in Immoral War, a reading on the Redacted Culture Cast. The piece was written, now this is off script, by the way. The piece was written in somewhat of a response to how Chris Hedges writes about war in his book, War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning. And it recognizes that this world that we engage in, when we're talking about violence, because war in this sense can be applied to understanding violence, is not something as simple as abstracting it to non-human concepts. Morality, since individuals are evaluated as moral or immoral, we cannot abstract that to institutions, governments, policies. Rather, it is up to the individual to choose to act morally or immorally. And this has come out of a series of readings. I think a series of books that might be worth reading and on that is actually starting with War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning by Chris Hedges. There's an essay that's a good one called Thoughts on Losing the War, and that one is freely available online. That's an interesting one on how it's talking about how cultures lost understanding of the wars that they fought. That's a good one. Another one would be My War Gone By, I Miss It So by Anthony Lloyd. And what I've understood from the literature that I've read is that people who saw the Bosnian conflict and people who observed the Bosnian conflict or the breakdown of Bosnia-Herzegovina or similar more contemporary expressions of violence is probably not the right term, but more, let's just say, wars of ideology, observed atrocities that they reported on. And those atrocities were oftentimes reported as if there was a force driving them that was not the will of the individuals. And this all comes to address in practicality to this subject that we talk about when we're referring to the philosophy of violence, to recognize a certain problem. And that problem is when we are engaging with understanding the philosophy of violence, which again is not a philosophy which advocates for violence, but rather how we understand violence, we are indebted with a responsibility to understand the moral complexities of it, because at no time could we say, well, I didn't know better. Regardless of whether that sounds good, violence itself and understanding it is one of those things that carries with it, as well as the capacity of violence, that carries with it an immense burden of responsibility to understand what we are dealing with. And through that understanding, we can navigate, orient, and direct our skill, our abilities, and our movements, our directions, our objectives going forward. And so it also serves as a warning, finally, of taking shortcuts. For those who are interested in joining the military, if you are tempted to see your opponents as less than human, to simplify them into something else, you're setting yourself up for failure. To those who think that soldiers do that, Shame on you. Probably that. It's probably the best way I can say it. Just shame on you. To the idea, the amount of hubris it requires to impose such a moral judgment should be called into question. But also, it's not that there isn't evidence that people have done it, which is the problem. It's that it somehow dehumanizes people into thinking that they had no choice. They had no choice to do otherwise, or they were controlled by some malice to do so. So, this is the conclusion of Moral Men and Immoral War. Thank you for listening to the Redacted Culture Cast. Thank you for supporting us at redactedllc.com. There you'll find our merch. And thank you for following us. So, that being the case, take care, and we'll see you soon.